We have Jeff King, who's a quality assurance engineer. He's going to be talking about robots in space. I'm at least excited for this presentation. This is also a remote presentation, so let's enjoy.
Welcome to RoboCon 2022. My name is Jeff King, and I'll be presenting Robots in Space. My contact information is available here. As you can see by that QR code, you'll be able to access my LinkedIn. I'm also available on the Robot Framework Slack forum with the name listed below. So allow me to go back a bit. January 2020, we were in Helsinki for RoboCon 2020. The world was a very different place. First of all, it was winter, and it's much warmer here today. But as you notice, people weren't wearing masks. People were moving freely. It was a very different time. I gave a presentation called the One-Man Robot Band. And during this presentation, I talked about using Robot Framework in an office where I was the only automation engineer, and at the time, really an undeveloped QA group. Right after the conference was over, it was decided that we'd be going to multiple QA. We were restructuring our QA group. We had a new QA manager, and we were going to add some QA engineers. Everything looked like it was on track for what we were building, but then the whole world changed with COVID. If you remember back to the beginning of COVID, at least in my office in the United States, about March 13th, that Friday the 13th, was the day where the offices closed. And from there on out, we thought we'd be out of office for 2 weeks, 4 weeks. And that turned into a month, a couple of months. For some places, it actually was such a business disruptor that businesses may have closed. They may have refocused on what they are doing. One business near me actually switched from reselling tickets to concerts to making masks. So there were some great changes at that time. And these changes were the same in my office as well. Now that we're a couple of years into that change, some of us have returned to the office. In the case of my company, most of us are not returned to the office and are working remotely. Doing my research for this presentation, I found that said that 59% of Americans can do their job from home. The trend is pretty much the same worldwide. And what we've also found is that tech jobs, even more so, can be done from home. Automation, however, had no effect from the quarantine or COVID. Automation ran as it was, and everything that we had scheduled before obviously worked fine as it was. For much of the QA workforce and not being in a frontline first responder type position, COVID was a big distractor for disruption for us, I should say. So we had to switch to working at home. And again, I've brought up the fact that many companies had some changes. In the case of our company, we had to reassign some people to work. We're in the travel industry, so there was a lot of people canceling their trips or postponing their trips because of COVID. So we had to take a lot of people and move them to deal with those customers directly. We were also in the process of changing our software development lifecycle. For us, that meant moving some people around and training some people on some DevOps processes, training them on just general software development lifecycle, and we were going to bring 2 people into the QA group to work on automation. The way that Robot Framework fit into this, for my company in specific, was that it allowed us to move people directly into the QA group, people with business knowledge, maybe people with development knowledge, but had come from a different company or were from a consulting firm. They were able to come in and start working on automation right away. And I'll get into what working on automation means because people had different roles and different exposures to Robot Framework. Some places had to change what they sold, what their business was. Maybe a business partner had changed. Some places sort of had a bit of a cool down where they could go into a maintenance mode, where they had time to redo some of their structure, even outside of their technology groups. Some places, because of what they were, became extremely busy. If you were a medical company, for instance, you probably had no time for maintenance. I came from a travel job, and before that I was in live arts. So those two industries were definitely changed in such a way that we had more maintenance or had to find new ways to be profitable. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about our transition. As I'd mentioned before, we brought two new people into our QA group that were related to automation. One of them was a business person, a business knowledge person, coming from our insurance claims department. The other one was an offshore consultant who had experience not just in QA, but also in development. The first thing we had to do right away as well was to give some of the other members of the QA team some experience with automation. So in the past, I would run a report, and if they asked for data or a report, I would generate it. In the case of, as we moved forward, we wanted to get people starting the reports on their own. We wanted to get them to create their own data through automation on their own. And we had to do all this while being remote, working not next to each other. For my company, that was a big shift. Most people outside of the sales and customer groups that would interface directly with customers were in the office. It was a big change for us, and I give my IT team a lot of credit for getting everyone up and moving so fast. And that's very important. And I'll say that we also need to think about how we prepare ourselves within automation. This is a list of the things that we got right and the things we got wrong. As I brought another person in, the biggest thing I noticed that no one could take a look at my keywords, even from the descriptions I'd written and what they were, and figure out exactly which keyword they were supposed to use. So I wanted to build blocks of functions so that from a process automation standpoint, people could use them. But when another automation engineer came in, we found I had to rework a lot of those. Where we were ready is that we had built out an automation server using Jenkins, and we were able from day one to just continue running automation, train users on Jenkins, train them on tagging in robot frameworks, tagging our test sets. So people were able to go right away. We were a bit behind with the Python migration, but we did have it planned. And we had documentation on how to use the automation. Again, this is something to think about, that there may be future disruptions. It might not be a global pandemic, but it could be a security breach within your software. You could have massive power outage. It doesn't matter. Disruptions are going to happen. And I think everything that we had in place before worked fine. The things that I needed to tool out were just mostly related to training or other users using software. Wanted to talk a bit about one of the two people that came into our group. He came in with a bit of a background, fortunately, in Python, but not much of a background in automation or in testing. What I was able to do was to meet with this user, go through some of the core functions in the Selenium library, and sort of hand off a project and let them look at it. And the feedback I got from this user was that the best way to learn for a non-automator, first-time automation user, is by trial and error. So he would grab a block of my keywords, start playing with them, and I'd ask him to change a couple of things. Our biggest stumbling blocks as we moved, one of the growing pains of switching to an online remote workplace was that some of our systems may have become laggy because we relied on our home internet connections. We relied on the connection at the office. So we had tests that would fail due to system performance. There's not much you can do about that. And as we made some changes to our UI, and most of our testing is UI testing, we found a lot of the locators changed. And I'm going to talk a bit later about smarter locators and how I was able to train the group on that. So when working with this automator, and he was the first one to come on, the first thing I did, as I mentioned before, was have him go through and use some of the existing test cases, just sort of go through and maybe tinker with a couple of things within them. Being Robot Framework, the first thing that he did tell me was that it was pretty easy to just go in there and look at the documentation on the keyword libraries for Selenium, for the built-in library, whatever the core library was we were using, whatever our API library was, because we sort of changed that a bit during the quarantine and during the pandemic. He was able to go in there and do that, and then we had him write an assertion keyword. And I'll talk a bit later about how he helped me come up with a way that we were going to put our tests together, which I thought was pretty cool, that somebody who could just start with Robot Framework as their first tool could come in and help us come up with a better process. Once we had him aboard, he was able to go in and reuse a lot of what we already had to add into our nightly test runs and assertions. We have one giant test set that runs on like our final QA environment. We have a bunch of different environments that we test on, and then we merge everything to a final QA one that's supposed to be production-like. He was able to take some of our keywords and then add in an assertion keyword on some of the UI screens. And he found it was really easy to use the Robot Framework tools to do this. So as I sound so positive about all the training, I will also add in there's things that I wish I had done better. And this is something to keep in mind if you're bringing in new people, whether they have an experience in automation, they have experience in development, or they're business people who are learning to use the automation tools. I had standard practices written. I had standards written on what a test case is, how a keyword works, some ideas about keywords, whether they were driving the function, whether they were helper keywords, and I had made sure that we commented what all these keywords meant. But we also did not have true development standards where we had to have IDs on all the elements, and some of the stuff that we were picking to do assertions on definitely did not have IDs. What I did not have, which was the most confusing thing for both my experienced automator and my non-experienced automator to learn, was how to use the locators. So the reason I think the struggles were there were that there was really no definition on what the locators were trying to do. So I created this game called Find the Button. Now, if you imagine, we have plenty of buttons on a screen, and we might want to assert that the button is there, but we also might want to use the button as a function. We might be dealing with code where the ID is not always the same. In the case of most of what I work on currently, most of the IDs do not change. In other software I've worked on in the past, IDs do change. IDs that are based on whatever's built as part of a transaction. So I would get the test back from my automators and look at them, and I'd say, this is going to work, but it might break down the road, and here's why. There's many different ways to find the button in this particular picture. We may even have buttons, we might have IDs within IDs, things move around. If you think about security captchas, I come from the live arts world as well. You might have a place that you need to click in order to purchase seats on a seat map. If you think of going to a rock concert or to a theater, you need to click on a place on the map. So fortunately, with the Selenium library, and we were still using Selenium at this point, in fact, we still use Selenium at this point, we were able to find areas on there to click in order to drive the process so that we were either doing an assertion on that screen, or we were doing an assertion maybe later on, or creating something that needed to be tested at the end. Working with the new automation team, I was able to sort of come up with a better way to look at our test case model. Being that we do a lot of UI testing, and a lot of what's exposed and what we're testing is customer facing. We have to deal with a lot of different browsers, perhaps different browser renderings, different sizes, and we also have to test on multiple systems because we might be making some major changes in two different development teams at the same time. So what we've sort of come up with here is what the purpose of each one of the keywords is within the test case. In our case, we do have to set different environments. We have to point to different environments. We also might have different views. We might be testing on a mobile view, not a mobile app. We're not using Appium at this point. I have used that in the past. But in this case, our arguments are basically based on what type of browser we're using, the size, and the rendering. Then let's say we have a process here where we're just logging in and we're buying something where we have a price that we set. This allows us, we have a standard user and password that might be going in to do this. That's in a locator file. we're able to go into the purchase page, whatever that is, and set our price. And then we do our assertion on the confirmation of that purchase. So we have our assertion function keyword. Once we have that, we take that result and we put that into our test run. We tell everyone we have these, in our case, I think it's 250 nightly use runs that we do, and we have these results. And the great thing about this is that this whole model sort of came from discussions with someone who had not done automation before, and then somebody who had done a lot of development work and come from a different automation group. So that brings us to the concept of time. Time changed a lot during the pandemic. We had some resources that we had to move, human resources, people that had to move to be more customer facing as we had to deal with things that were brought about in our business by the pandemic. In some places, that meant doing more work with less people. We had to bring some stuff on board really fast to sell for our business to sustain itself. Many businesses did. And we also needed to think about our training time. So if we all remember back to the start of the pandemic, it was a lot of Zoom calls. This is a picture up here of a Zoom with my family where my great-grandmother is looking at drawings that my niece has made. Or I should say my grandmother, that's her great-granddaughter's drawing. And I, of course, snuck in the poster I have from RoboCon 2020 in there. But how do we have these technologies, we can see each other. What happened? From my talking to many people and from our own experience, there were a lot of these Zoom calls on time, and over time we sort of stopped doing these sort of Zoom calls where we would talk about planning, or we would talk about business continuation. We would even do like social calls. And over time, we sort of eased back on those a bit, and it became more of a solo mission times. And I've kind of tried to graph this out. Fortunately, in the case of my business, I do have to time track, and I am able to see where I was working. And if you notice over time, the first couple of weeks, there wasn't much automation at all. There was a lot of non-automation tasks I had to do just to get things going. I had to do a lot of manual testing. We sort of came up with a new QA process at the same time as well, which involved writing a lot of manual test cases, which would be used in automation later. But as you see over time, there was less of discussion of teams and how we're going to continue our business, and more about project-specific time and automation. And I think pretty much across the board in many industries, I got the same sort of feedback that this is sort of where things were going. Also, we started doing some more manual processes. In our case, we were using some non-QA resources to do operational user acceptance testing, but they needed data in our test system. It sort of came up like, how does this benefit us time-wise? A lot of what I was working on was to take an existing test that was meant for a functional process or an assertion and turn it into a data creation test. On the previous slide, you'll notice in this particular case here, it took me about 2 to 4 hours of work to take an existing assertion keyword function and turn it into, I'm not using test templates. Test templates are something that can be done. But in this case, I am able to take what I had, add some arguments in, and sort of run through and create the data that's needed. So in this particular one, right here, I'm just going to highlight the test cases as the most important part. Let me go back. We have a bunch of values that we're going to be putting into our API purchase string. I don't have the purchase string up here, and I don't even have the function up here because it's sort of a customized thing. But just keep in mind that there's a bunch of values that are sent in, and the output is a purchase in our system. At the beginning, I set all the random values for all the possible things that we can add into the test. This might be like the credit card number, the amount being purchased, maybe if there's some sort of product you're purchasing, whatever that is. And then I have a line where I can have the values that are given that are needed for the test set. In this case, let's say I was asked to make 100 purchases, one purchase one unit, one purchase 2 unit, one purchase 3 unit, so on and so on, or maybe a list of credit cards. I want to make sure that we can purchase with 100 different credit cards. I was able to use this test piece here and plug that into the functionality that we already had in order to do the purchase and create a bunch of data. Some other things we used for automated process, we did screenshots. Again, I've talked about this in my 2020 presentation. We could do screenshots of the workflow just using the capture page screenshot. We can do tests in different pricing grids in our case with the same functionality I've written before. We can do copies from one environment to the other where we don't have a copy utility, where we just basically grab all the values on the screen and go in with the keywords we have and input those in. Automation has different stakeholders. Within these, they may be people of different skill level. We have skill level all over the place at our company. We have developers and we have people who just want to see the report output. The great thing about Robot Framework is whoever touches it might see a different piece. They might see a different type of language. For us, in QA, we're writing tests. We need to know how to write code. Some of us need to know how to use Python. Some of us just use what's out of the box. But the syntax itself also lends itself to our entire QA and dev group. So we can say, yeah, we have done assertions on these. We used these keywords to do assertions. I've verified that this text is on page. And in some ways, that helped a lot with our communication within our group when we couldn't meet over Zoom or have these long calls. We're also able to simplify our reports. So we have people who just look at reports. They want to know, some people want to know how many tests passed. That's very easy to do. Some people want to see pictures of the failed tests. A QA manager might want to know where the failures are occurring, or a development manager. And then we can also show a developer, hey, your test is failing on this step. We're using a lot of arguments in our test cases in order to do that. And again, some people also had a lot of time, just the way their business was, to reevaluate their processes, go through and do some maintenance, come up with their own best practices. In our case, it was a lot of cleaning up keywords and defining if a keyword was really meant for assertion, for functionality, and in some cases just adding argument-based test cases with our keywords. One last thing I did want to touch on is that many people did switch jobs and went into this whole race of switching jobs during the pandemic. I think we had, 1 in 4 tech jobs. I have some links up here. The slides will become available. Very interesting just on how some of the things changed. But to go into the side of it with Robot Framework, people who came in to an organization that had Robot Framework, because of the ease of use, were able to jump right in. They were able to fix things. They might have ideas on best practices that weren't there before. And people were also able to add some new tests, maybe a new library they've worked with, a new way of thinking about testing things. People that were coming in new, the thing about Robot Framework is it forces the structure. You may create prototypes really quickly, but you may also be jumping on another tool. And because of your experience, because you're touching Python, you're touching Selenium, in some cases JavaScript, many of the other tools use those. So it really does give you a background where you can work on that. Just think of the conclusion here that Robot Framework has the Swiss Army knife of automation tools. I talked about that in my last presentation, but I'll bring up that we always are going to have disruptions at work. They might be a pandemic, they might be a power outage, it could be anything in between. Having a diverse and strong tool for automation allows you to do many things. So that's my presentation, and before I go, I do want to say thank you for everyone for listening to this, and I also want to say thank you to the people I talked to and the forum that allowed me to create this, and congratulations to everyone for making it through a pandemic. I know this is a challenge for us all, but you all did it, and congratulations. Thank you very much.
Jeff King. Give a big hand to Jeff King. Hello, Jeff, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Excellent. Hey, thank you for the talk. We have a few questions for you.
Okay.
First question, if I understood correctly, you taught new people automation. Any thoughts on how to teaching automation to people?
Yeah, definitely have the people. I went a lot by example, and then just let them try to take it apart themselves. And if you look at the for the hybrid presentation, we have that playground room. It was a lot like that, where we just took some code and sort of had them play with it. They also used a lot of the UI tools as they were getting used to it.
The next question is kind of related to the breakout room thing. So how did you actually organize the group work on Zooms?
So a lot of it at first was just me sort of demoing how I went about things. And then I sort of took some of my knowledge as far as what tasks took me the most time, and I tried to give the people with more technical background, I gave her more of the difficult stuff that might not involve just UI locators and manipulating. And the other person who was more of the business expert, I gave him a lot of the simpler, what we would consider simpler UI tasks, just to take advantage of his strength with that.
And one last question. Did you track your time usage on this level already before COVID? Because I think, I'm not sure if it was your personal time management graphs we saw, or was it the team, but for me at least, it was mind-blowing to actually see a graph of someone's or some group's time management.
Yeah, we're big on time tracking here. The last place I worked as well, very big on the time management, tying it back to items directly. I think there was more of an emphasis as we went remote, because I think management wanted to make sure we weren't sitting there gaming during work hours or something. But it was great to have that and look back and just see how it changed. And I also got feedback from others as well on their time.
Excellent, excellent. I think that was something that we all could probably learn to track our time better and actually visualize it, because we can hide the truth from us pretty easily. Hey, Jeff can be found from the Speakers Corner on the online platform. Once more, let's thank Jeff King for the excellent presentation. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, everyone.
Next up, we have one more break. So we have 30 minutes break. We start here again at 5 o'clock. So let's go grab some coffee and have some fun and come here at 5 o'clock. Thank you.